Biological Code Podcast, a podcast on Germanische Heilkunde. Today we're talking about cracked corners of the mouth. Heike's son Tim was 3 years old when one day he showed her the corners of his mouth. They were all cracked. At first, Heike didn't take it very seriously and just said, "Don't worry, they will get better again." She had known Germanische Heilkunde for over 10 years, but at that moment it simply didn't come to mind. But when she saw the next day that the cracks had become deeper and already quite painful for Tim, she started to think and wonder what was going on. Anyone familiar with Germanische Heilkunde will naturally begin to look for the conflict. How would you proceed? What would you look for? In this case of cracked skin, we are dealing with a localized active separation conflict, and with Tim, it was associated with the mouth. And so the conflict was quickly found. Tim had gotten into a habit that Heike wasn't very fond of. He would regularly eat sand at the playground. The two went to the playground several times a week, and Tim really loved to play in the sandbox. Because Heike knew Germanische Heilkunde, she wasn't concerned about the dirt, but she was afraid that Tim would eat sand and that the neighborhood cats could have urinated in. Unfortunately, he often did this when other children and parents were around, which Heike also found embarrassing. That's why Heike had been trying for a while to break him off this habit. She first spoke quite reasonably with him and wanted to make it clear that sand wasn't food and therefore shouldn't be eaten. Heike simply tried to make him understand that people just don't do that. It didn't help that Heike had a memory of her own childhood, of a neighborhood friend who'd been teased relentlessly for eating sand at the playground. He was given a nickname over it, and it followed him around for years. But Tim was only 3 and didn't fully understand yet. Although in itself, it's nothing bad, and if it had been at home, with a sandpit that could have been covered when not in use, she wouldn't have made such a big deal out of it. But as it was, she wanted to stop this public habit. So what had happened to cause the separation conflict for Tim? Recently, Tim was at the playground sandbox. And what was he doing? Oh no. He was eating sand again, right in front of other parents and children. So what had the conflict been? 2 days earlier, Heike had lost her temper. She had taken her son aside and suddenly told him very firmly that she wouldn't keep repeating herself over and over again. If she caught him eating sand again, she would make him eat a whole plate full of sand. It's obvious that in that very moment he wanted to be separated from his mother, and he associated it precisely at the spot where he imagined he'd have to eat a whole plate full of sand. And that because his mom didn't want to talk herself hoarse anymore. When Heike realized this, she could only shake her head at herself. But she also immediately knew how to help her son Tim resolve his conflict. As soon as he woke up from his afternoon nap, she would speak with him about it. She simply asked him if he remembered what she had said to him about the sand eating. Of course he remembered. His mom had never spoken so firmly to him before. And then she simply told him he didn't need to worry anymore. She definitely wouldn't force him to eat a plate full of sand. Definitely not. They started to giggle and both seemed relieved. That same evening, around 7 p.m., the skin was already healing and closed. "Does it still hurt?" asked Heike. No. By the next day, the cracked corners of his mouth were hardly visible anymore. After 2 days, nothing could be seen at all. In Germanische Heilkunde, the second biological law speaks of the law of 2 phases. In Tim's case, he was in the conflict active phase with cracked skin for 2 days. After resolving the conflict through that conversation with his mom, the healing phase also took 2 days. A few more words on Germanische Heilkunde, which is based on the 5 biological laws of nature. Without a biological conflict, there is no significant biological special program. So for Tim, the threat of having to eat a whole plate full of sand, A. experienced as highly dramatic, B. completely unexpected, he hadn't anticipated that, and C. he was isolated with it, felt alone with it. What had reacted? The outer skin. It becomes numb and dry in the active phase. In this case, so strongly that cracks, so-called fissures, appeared right away. So the outer skin itself doesn't hurt in the active phase, but with a crack, the deeper layers of the skin are exposed, which are not numb and therefore hurt. The outer skin is controlled by the outer germ layer, more precisely by the sensory cortex. It is always about separation, either not wanting to be separated or wanting to be separated. Wanting to be separated locally is relatively common. It is always only about the perception at the moment of the DHS, the biological conflict, and it bypasses the mind and triggers the corresponding special program in the brain. Of course, Tim doesn't want to be completely separated from his mother Heike, but from what she had in mind, yes. Separation conflict doesn't mean that one would like to be separated completely from that person, but from the action that they take, of course. Fortunately, Heike knew what she was dealing with. Otherwise, Tim might have had to struggle with those cracked mouth corners for a long time. If you understand the principles of Germanische Heilkunde, you can wonderfully help your family, and often, even before long-term and persistent symptoms arise. Learn the basics, the guiding principles of Germanische Heilkunde. They aren't difficult, and once you understand how wonderfully nature is arranged within our bodies, you will naturally lose your fear of illness. Learn to think biologically. The knowledge of Germanische Heilkunde belongs in every household. If you want to learn more about how to apply the 5 biological laws into your everyday life, you can find more information on our association's website, urkraftleben.at, or join our program at thebiologyproject.org. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Telegram, and Instagram. You can now find this podcast also on Apple Podcasts. Thank you for listening. Until next time.